This episode of Future Cities Africa is brought to you in partnership with Digital Council Africa. How do we improve private and public sector collaboration? What are some of the steps that needs to be taken, and who takes the first step?
So, a lot of it is private participation is only going to happen if it's profitable. It has to be profitable, because if it's not, then you're unable to provide the technologies, provide the training, provide the skills and capabilities you require. So you need to be able to provide them the ability to make sufficient return of capital that they're happy to invest on areas which is important for the municipality to move things forward. So it's almost like a trade-off and balancing between them. And I think the private companies have to be prepared to take on what would seem non-profitable projects, but look at it holistically as a balance across all the projects they're getting, to be able to see an overall total profit rather than everything must have a profit. And I think then if we can have that understanding and compromise, then we may look at a way to actually start making a difference. And then after a while, the net profit will be positive. And I think also the time period for contracts needs to be looked at. Often just a 3-year contract is not long enough to implement and get results. So probably a lot longer term contracts need to be considered.
I think they're going to become probably more and more important with time. I think it always works when both parties understand and agree that there's benefit and value on both ends of the deal. And I think that from a government point of view, yes, there's great opportunities for public-private partnership. Obviously, yes, there's a lot of legislation that one needs to work through to ensure that it's always fair and equitable. And I know sometimes with private partnerships, that does get a bit frustrating because that's considered a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. But with that said, I think that, I always say to private partners that want to partner with government to say that if you're willing to stick with it for the long haul, then let's talk about this, because it is definitely, when you want to work with government, something that you need to want to do and see it as a longer term partnership. But I think that when you're just looking for quick wins, I won't lie, I think government, I wouldn't say is unnecessarily slow, but when you are looking after citizen money, I think there's a need for governance and compliance that we all know should be there. And so, I think it really is about partnering and understanding each other, and expectations behind that can create positive private-public partnerships. And I think we've seen a lot of those out there already.
We can talk public-private partnerships, right? But unless you understand what capability you have within the city and what capabilities you require that don't exist there, that's the platform or that's the point of discussion to say, okay, where do we need partnerships? So I think that a clear, detailed digital strategy and strategic execution plan is the starting point for discussions around public-private partnerships. And because if you look at, let's look at it, right? What are the big type of inventory items do you want from a public-private partnership? Funding would be one of those things, right? The other things, is it just funding? You'd also require capability, right? Capacity and capability, development capability, data science capability, app development capability, support capability, innovation capability. So where do you get that from? And only once you've done your strategy and understand where the gaps are, you have the starting point to talk public-private partnership. And I must say, I work with a number of cities as well, and let's look at the big metros, right? You've got City of Johannesburg as an example, with many universities and students around here, that can help with it. You've got a lot of the vendors that sit here. It's the same with Durban and Cape Town. Even when you move to smaller towns now, the fact that we're all working online now means that, and the fact that we've got platforms like Azure, Amazon and AWS in South Africa already, that provides a lot of the software capability in a cloud environment, means that, hey, there may be a smart developer that doesn't even sit in the city. He can be working from anywhere, and they can once again, access the data, access the platforms, through broadband connectivity, and develop smart city solutions. So we've got the building blocks for public-private partnerships. Where do we fit the building blocks in? And that's what I'm alluding to.
There needs to be a compact to get to a smarter city that leverages, at least in South African terms, in the context of Cape Town, the power that the public sector brings as well as the private sector. And that is not just about in terms of technology, but unlocking public goods and public value that is to the benefit of both the public good as well as the market. And ultimately, I think what has to change to enable that is perhaps a different approach to how we view the legal and contractual relationship of public-private partnerships. There is always a very big impulse to talk about the power of both sectors working together to create social and economic change. And I think that that's absolutely true and foundational. But the mechanisms have to be in place in order to enable that in a way that is desirable for both partners. And, our experience with the regime of triple Ps at the moment is really one that doesn't lend itself naturally to uptake. And I think that needs to be considered for a review and considered for how can that process be streamlined so that there is, we can secure the goods of effective governance of a mutually beneficial relationship between the public and private sector, but do so in a way that is easier to unlock and easier to create shared value.
I think the single biggest problem that we've got is the intergovernmental collaboration. So in order for us to deploy telecommunications infrastructure, you don't just rely on a single entity. It's not just municipalities necessarily that are involved in it. So there are several other entities that are involved in the deployment. As an example, property owners. So you will still need the approval of property owners to deploy telecommunications infrastructure. And every single one of these processes that you have to go through delays the pace at which you're deploying, because you often have to enter into negotiations, you have to, consult with the wider public, and processes and procedures are really important, and they have to be there because they also protect all our own interests. But I think the big problem that the sector has got is the inability for timelines to be set to the process. So it makes it almost impossible for you to effectively plan your projects. And the problem that the telecommunications sectors experience is not so much the processes, it's just the timelines or the lack of timelines associated with the process. So you can enter into a process to deploy infrastructure somewhere, and that process can take you anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months to 3 to 5 years, depending on what telecoms infrastructure you're trying to get out there.
It's a tough one because, we know that in South Africa, we struggle with so many things. We struggle with this urgency, first of all, to see things done and fixed because it's been too long. For many people, it's been too long and the urgency is real. And so we struggle with people wanting to see things move faster. We struggle with our trust deficit where we don't always, we talk about public and private needing to work together, but we know that we don't do that very well. And so I think we have to keep at some of those things. I've feared for some time now that there's a level of fatigue. I think that many officials have begun to suffer with this idea of needing to engage with anybody at all. Because at some stage you're just hurtful. You're like, let's just get on with what we know needs to be done. And on some level, I think that's correct where the agenda is clear. But in the urban space, there's so much in the agenda that's not clear and that's evolving and that needs constant engagement and that needs partnership if we're to afford and figure out some of these things. So I think we need to invest a lot more, first of all, skill in facilitating the stakeholder engagements. I think we need a lot more openness on both sides. Well, it's not both sides, on all sides, because I think it's also communities and it's also the science community. It's on so many levels. We need to invest, I think the skill and the time to understand that this is going to take time. It's for the long haul. It's not, I think I was saying yesterday in a session that, sometimes we behave as though the time for participation and consultation was done and now we should just be getting on with it. But that's not how things work. And then we could look to the rest of the world to recognize that. So I think if we want to get beyond a situation where everything is, it's conflict or complete agreement and there's nothing in between. If we want to get beyond that, then I think we need to figure out how to do this better. And that links to how we are governed and how we govern ourselves across sectors, not only in government. So I think also leaving that to being the problem of government to figure out probably isn't a wise choice.
I think part of the challenge in the way I've understood it, just from the various places that I've worked in and the work that I do, is that often the way in which the systems are structured for partnerships and collaboration tends to be a very tick box exercise. And we miss the opportunity to have real and authentic conversations with each other and move the agendas forward in the interest of those who use systems, whether those be public transport systems or non-motorized transport infrastructure interventions, that we have these as very academic exercises. We look at how we do integrated development plans, integrated transport plans, often very consultant driven. And of course, not having anything against consultants, but I think when we miss the interface with user voice and user perspective, we miss a whole chunk. So often many of those, whether they're in public sector or private sector, who are planning for our urban spaces are doing so from the luxury of a private vehicle, have little to no inkling of what it's like to walk in our cities, to cycle in our cities, to use public transport in our cities, and are then coming up with interventions that essentially miss the mark of what it is we're trying to do. And that often the focus is on the mode or the solution that is coming without really understanding what it is that we're trying to solve. So, my sense is that often these conversations are very academic, very theoretical, very desktop in their nature. Of course, we're now living through a particular period in time, but I think just, from my period in the city of Johannesburg through to the work that I do now, just how do people arrive as their whole selves in the work they do? And so, one of the things that resonates for me, Daniel, is when I started in the city of Johannesburg, knowing, as I've said to you from my background, knowing little to nothing about transport planning, transport engineering, my immediate reference point was to go back to my own life experiences in relation to transport and how those had shaped my understanding of the world. And it became very apparent to me very quickly that mobility and access to mobility is, firstly, it's a life cycle issue, all the way from how a pregnant mum gets to her checkups and gets to a birthing experience and the first trip made home with a child, right through to how one's final bodily remains get to the last resting place. And right through that life cycle, in fact, your life is either enabled or disabled by access to mobility. And so often I think we have these conversations in very academic, theoretical ways without bringing the personal and lived experiences of people to how we plan these systems.
One of the challenges that we face is coordination. So there are multiple projects that would happen, not only driven by just government, local government or provincial or national government. There are other projects that are being done by private entities, by NGOs, and there's no coordination of those projects. You know, there are resources that are going to one more than the other, etc. And so I think the relationship between the two, you know, needs to be strengthened in having a common vision and a common goal that everyone's working towards, and working out the incentives for either, be they moral, be they financial, be they economic or social, but there's some incentives that can be worked out. And I think that's one of the challenges that are there between the different stakeholders. The interesting thing, Dan, is that, you know, we all want to have so let's say as a business, you know, you want to be able to realize the purpose of your business. And then there's a service that you render, and then there are things that you expect, and you want to be able to do that within the ambit of the law. You don't want anything else that's going to disturb that process. On the part of government, they've got to protect the citizens. So sometimes, you know, the business entity wants everything at all cost, you know, and then government needs to step in, and then it delays things and so on. But it's finding each other that's key. How, I think, is what we would have to work out.
So I think collectively we are stronger. There needs to be a reinvention of our concept of what constitutes intellectual property. It's not a problem for a building owner, for example, to share that their building is either using too much or too little electricity, or over or under occupied, because what that allows a city to do is to take more decisions around what they can do to support that particular development. It's not a go it alone scenario anymore. The more that we can come together and share our information, the more that we can create a system of active support. And that's essentially a role that I think our municipalities can take very powerfully. It makes the idea of being a citizen and of paying our rates to belong to a city and to have access to services beyond just the basic services of I want to make sure I've got water and electricity coming to my building, but then the concept of receiving a service is linked to business intelligence. It's linked to quality of life metrics, and it's linked to suggestions around what we can do to make our environments more sustainable and more equitable. So we need to remove the silos. We need to look at a more aggregated environment. And for our municipalities, that means defining a smart city strategy that looks at standardization of information sharing protocols, and even perhaps incentivizing or rewarding the information sharing amongst its private sector and other stakeholders so that we can all collectively win.